Thank you for joining me as I surf the waves of truth on the streams of consciousness, looking for the answers that lie inside. Welcome to Matrix Unplugged. Hello and welcome to Matrix Unplugged, where you will hear the ramblings of an absolutely certifiably sane man who thinks he's crazy, who knows he's crazy. However, I will talk about things that are perhaps off topic and things that make sense consciously, but perhaps they're not in the mainstream of the thought process of what is possible. I want to begin off by saying that this is called the Matrix Unplugged, and one thing that has to deal with the Matrix is programming. If one can start to see themselves as a type of wetware, like human software, that I am a computer, a supercomputer, one can start to look into the possibility of being manipulated by software, by programs. So one of the key things about programming is programming deals with mirroring and patterns. That's how the child, when it's first born, how it starts to associate with the things around it. It mirrors the patterns that it sees, whether that's a verbal pattern or it's a visual pattern, or maybe even just a frequency pattern, like hearing someone's anger and feeling that vibration of what that anger is like in the body. All of these things go off of something that I call U programming. And to kind of set the standard on taking responsibility for my own actions, I like to set the standard as hyper responsibility and extreme integrity. And how I do that is, as often as I can, being as mindful as possible of what I'm saying to make sure that I'm not putting that thought or that belief on someone else by saying you. It's a challenging concept because when I first heard it, when I was first told about it by one of my mentors several years ago, I was against it. I was completely against especially being told I was wrong, because that was how the information that I got, that's how I kind of took it, was this person saying I'm wrong. When I stopped judging that individual for what information they were trying to tell me, even though every time I said, well, you know how when you go here and do this, and that person would say, no, I don't, because I've never been there and I've never done that. And there was suddenly an epiphany where I realized that my reality that I was talking about to someone else was not necessarily their reality. And even if they had been able to have the exact same experience, or at least they did the same thing that I did or went through the same thing and I was there with them, there's no way that I can know what that was like for them. We could have both been on a roller coaster ride, and her experience could have been completely different from mine, entirely different. So this U programming, I started to realize that in conversations, a lot of times I was talking to other individuals and saying, you do this, you do that, you do this. And what I realized was it had very little to do with the other person. It had everything to do with my own personal reality and my belief systems and my thoughts that go into that belief system and why it makes me do the things I do. So I started to question why I was telling people to do things. And I started to realize that the times when I wanted to give people what I considered the best advice were the times that advice was so much more about me than it was about them. Seeing how one is acting and then looking at that person and saying, you're wrong for doing that. Let me give you some advice. And oftentimes advice is rarely ever asked for, ever. From my experience, I find most individuals want to talk about their problems. They want to get the problems out there because they don't want the problems sitting next to their heart. They won't want it sitting there bugging them. And that's how my experience has been, is I got to get this out. So when having a conversation with someone, I started to take ownership and responsibility of how much of what I was telling others to do was I not doing myself, even though I had these beliefs or these standards that I expected them to adhere to. And I suddenly was in this space of what I call hyper responsibility and extreme integrity, sort of like a modern stoicism or revival of stoicism. So I was realizing that the things that I was telling others had more to do about me than them. And some of the best advice I ever gave was actually to myself when I was looking to tell somebody something that I felt that they needed some guidance. And I started to realize it's more about me than it is about them. And oftentimes the things that I was the most upset about others doing wasn't bothering them at all. And the less it bothered them, the more it bothered me. I would spend all this time sitting in my room looking at the ceiling and brooding over something which I had this thought process of suddenly thinking about them and thinking about where they were at the time. And I realized they weren't thinking about me. Most likely not. They were off doing something else. At least they weren't thinking about me in the way that I was thinking about them, that I was upset at them because they didn't follow my advice or they didn't do what I wanted them to do. And I realized the tremendous amount of trauma, the tremendous amount of pain that I was unable to look at in myself, the rejection of someone not listening to me. And I suddenly started to see others around me within the simulation, what I call the inverted matrix. I suddenly started to see them as characters in my game, like I was an avatar. I was this character. And I started to realize that my relationship with these other characters in this game were mirrored reflections simply of my relationship with myself. And I started to see myself as a ship. And these were the relations I had with other ships. So I started to see how people interacted with me and how I interacted with them. And when I looked at what they were doing and I realized that I had a problem with what they were doing, I started to look inside to see where that problem really was. What was going on in me that was causing a judgment in them, that was causing this projection outside of me. And every single time I blamed them, or I thought, I need to get away from these kind of people. They're constantly in my life. I need to do something about it so they're not here. What I figured out was it was in me. There was some sort of trauma. There was some sort of damage that was done at some point in my life. And I wasn't sure exactly what that was. However, when I stopped blaming someone else and started sitting with, what is this attraction to these individuals in my life that continues to bring them into my life? Because giving an example, in my dating experience, I would have this experience of, well, they just seem to be a little bit controlling, or they just seem to be just a little bit manipulative. And after a certain point, when there's 6 in a row, I had to maybe take a hard ego look at playing the victim and kind of sit back and go, well, if they all have similar qualities and there's been 6 of them, maybe it's about me and not necessarily about them. And from what I've found in the ego structure, which I call the organic AI, because the ego system operates very much like an artificial intelligence. Don't get me wrong, the ego, from its original design in the human being, it's an important tool. It's an important device to sense out danger, to protect one from danger. And very, very prominent during like the Paleolithic man, when the ego was needed to prevent one from falling off a cliff. It was good for spatial awareness. It was good for determining what the boundaries were, the parameters, if you will, of the reality of the individual, of the human being. And I can't speak for every human being that was alive during that time. However, it's it's determined that the survival mentality that was built into the ego system very much controlled the ecosystem of the body. It was very beneficial for a fight or flight response, getting into a sympathetic nervous system and taking over the body and making sure that non-essential systems in the body were shut down or repressed, like the sexual reproductive system, digestive system, immune system. All those things being suppressed allowed for the autonomic system to take over completely and the body to go into a heightened state of awareness. So the ego system was good for that, defining that type of reality according to that individual's consciousness at the time. If someone that's in a state of consciousness constantly of survival cannot raise consciousness very much higher than the bridge of their nose, because they're in the constant state of either fighting to get food or running away from being food. They're in that survival method. And that kind of energy, that kind of epigenetics has traveled through generations and has been repeated through different world wars and the Great Depression and things like that. So that energy is still present, or has been still present, within the collective consciousness. And that's very much something that has to be purged out on a collective level. But from what I've found is it starts with me. It starts with my own personal traumas. And those can go back to childhood, who or what I was at the time when the trauma occurred. Because the association of saying that, oh, that's me then, it is and it isn't, because I can't even bring myself into that level of consciousness of who I was at 4. I can remember, I can regain memories, but the entity that exists as that trauma is almost separate. And that is where I started to realize this you programming, and how saying you is not taking responsibility for one's actions. It's not taking responsibility for, and it's not honoring the person that is now in my space as this character that has come into my space that I'm not really too thrilled about it being there. This character that is now here, I'm not honoring its presence, as instead of it being a shadow or something dark, it is essentially the dark coming up to give me the answers that I seek. And this is completely the way that I've done it. This is my battle in the trenches, and this is how I've healed myself. And I'm not about to say this is the end all be all of how to heal oneself, because there's so many different experiences out there, and there's so many different individuals as their own universe, the universe. And I don't pretend to say that I have all the answers. These are just the answers that work for me. However, there's a resonance. And when there's a resonance and it resonates with someone on a heart level, on a soul level, and they say, wow, that feels like that'll work for me, then this, as my own personal truth, becomes your personal truth. That it is not just my personal truth. It becomes true for the reality that I'm looking to experience. And that reality is going to be unique in my own way. So looking at it from that standpoint, everything is a mirror. Every character that comes into my space is a mirror. It's there to show me what I'm attracting. And that becomes a very hard lens to look through. An interesting paradigm shift occurs at that point. Because then what I started to see was everything that I was attracting was showing me who I was, or at least who I'd been programmed to be, based off of the things that have been told to humanity, that we are a product of our environment and our experience. Well, that's the avatar. And if that's the case, then there's no hope for anyone who's had some sort of trauma in their past. So what I start to look at from that standpoint is, if that's the case, there wouldn't be this tremendous amount of really intelligent, really emotionally intelligent, not just IQ, empathic individuals out here that have healed their traumas, that have created a different outlook, that have put forth so much to contribute to healing and to healing the collective, healing the collective pain. So when I talk about the inverted matrix, the inverted matrix is the thing that is plugged into the ego system, back into the back of the neck. It's an energetic cord. And that ego system, like I said, was a great and beautiful thing when it was originally created. However, as this machine learning type of organic AI device called the ego system began to develop, it is machine learning, so it continues to create boundaries and it continues to create constructs based off of belief systems. So when I go to say something about you, if I don't have the self-awareness to realize that that's about me, then I wouldn't have said you in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The inverted matrix, how it works, is this machine learning ecosystem creates a survival template. That survival template is going to be based off of a polarity. And that polarity will be, because there really is very few human beings from what I found that are completely neutral, there'll be some form of trauma. Now, trauma doesn't have to be something along the lines of something extreme. Trauma is going to be unique to every single person. As I was writing the other day, trauma can be something as simple as a bicycle was denied of a child for Christmas. They never got the bicycle they wanted, and that was traumatic. And that could be extremely traumatic, or they didn't get a cookie out of the cookie jar when they were promised a cookie. It forms the foundation. The trauma forms that foundation. The 3D trauma forms the foundation of the avatar, from what I've found. Now, in saying that, trauma is anything that is found to be in resistance of one's soul desire, what someone is here to do. When that trauma is introduced, it creates a world that is unsafe and feels unsafe. And that world being unsafe will then create a survival mentality, and a polarity occurs. We have two different polarities. We have the polarity of service to self, and we have the polarity of service to others. Now, within that polarity, both are traumatized, and both avatars are in a place of insecurity. And that insecurity is something is unsafe, the world is unsafe. So the polarity of a service to self will tend to raise itself on a pedestal, to essentially over-dominate with masculine energy in order to never be dominated again. Once that soul choice has happened, the ego system takes full control over that avatar and starts to build that up. If that person thinks that they are their avatar, they're a product of their environment and experience, then it will build that up. On the other hand, the service to others polarity seeks to put everyone else on a pedestal. It seeks to take more of a inferior feminine. So you have inferior masculine or just masculine, you have inferior feminine or just feminine, which will then make it about everyone else. And these are not male and female as energies. This is just feminine energy more as a magnetic, and we have masculine more as an electro, making the bioelectromagnetic frequency, which is the aura around the body. And that is created from these energies of masculine and feminine moving through. So that feminine energy will create a pedestal, regardless if the person is male, female, doesn't matter. They take that polarity that it's all about everyone else, and the other polarity will take the understanding that it's only about themselves and it must be about themselves. Both are forms of survival. Both are codependencies in order to survive. So the reality from what I've seen is of being someone that it was about everyone else. It's all about serving everyone else. Everyone else is more important than me because the trauma that occurred means that I'm not worth it. So others are more important. In that trauma, the trauma then gets solidified, calcified, so to speak. And it kind of hides away. The ego system is good at just kind of compartmentalizing it and putting it into a sub-alter ego type thing or a core belief system. And in that core belief system, it's very difficult to use neuro-linguistic programming to try and change that. From what I've found, most of it comes up in physical trauma into the environment or mental, spiritual trauma as it unfolds. So from that mentality with the service to others construct of this piecing these core beliefs together is that it's about everybody else, service to others. And it actually creates a codependency gridlock of seeking others to please instead of oneself. And what occurs with that is more than anything, the service to others individual wants to experience love, wants to experience something that can heal the trauma or heal the pain. However, the core belief creates a reality that attracts only those that are going to siphon off their energy, because the service to others individual lives in a world where it's not possible to have that service done to them. They live in a world where it's only possible to be in service of others. So they don't take time for themselves. They don't practice self-love. They don't create that space where they're worth it. Thus, they can't create anything or attract anything that says that they are until they start to love themselves. In the other camp, the service to self is constantly attracted, and it's like a magnet, a delicious source of energy to service to others. They are prey to the service to self. Both have insecurities. Neither of them want to deal with them. So one, it becomes about everyone else, and the other one, it becomes about only themselves. Within a dualistic, bipolar, third-dimensional, light-dark type of understanding, these energies are endlessly meeting each other. Regardless of what the person and their desires wants, it's about how the avatar was created. And opening up that consciousness, that spirituality, if you will, that the consciousness of not being those things. Because what took place was I started to realize who I thought I was by what I was attracting. I made an intention to be different. I made an intention to become different, to live in a world where my reality would match that of what I wanted. However, what I wanted was far different than what I had received. So it was the ego system was continually repeating who I thought I was, if that makes sense. In that form, I was attracting things. After making an intention of what I wanted, I was getting everything I didn't want. Because I put out this intention so strongly that I wanted to be loved, or I wanted to be financially free, or I wanted to be healthy, or whatever it was, all of these things would show up that were the opposite. And then having my religious background, that would be, oh, well, it's the devil. It's someone else. It's something else outside of me. You. I started to realize all the things that made up who I thought I was by what I was attracting. It became this really clever tool of the inverted matrix, that everything that I didn't want that was coming into my space was the inversion of what I did want. That meant that there was implants. There was what I call cellular magnetics based off of the trauma, whether it was trauma that occurred from childhood or I inherited that through the bloodline that I was born into. It was there. And if I am simply just my avatar and I'm a robot essentially going through a script, I'm a character in a movie, but I'm not directing or writing the script, then ultimately, if I think that's who I am, I'm condemned. It's fate that I'm going to do and be and have the life that I have based off of my experience and my upbringing, my environment. However, when I got to the lowest point that I possibly could of trying to figure out who I was, or I was actually in such a state of fighting off everything else that I could not figure out who I was, because I was too busy focusing on who I was not. And I was too busy on focusing on who I didn't want to become. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to focus on something that someone doesn't want. But that's what I was finding, was the more I didn't want something, the more I wanted something, the more I would get the opposite. So it had to be something about me that was attracting this, something about me that was bringing this in, and it was the cellular magnetics. And those cellular magnetics were actually keeping me where I was. It was keeping me plugged into the inverted matrix avatar that it had for me, instead of who I wanted to be. And everyone that was appearing in my reality was making sure that I was going to adhere to who I thought I was. And I was attracting that. And I finally took responsibility that it was me. It was me that was creating this for myself. And when I did that, things started to change.